So a few days ago, Destiny YouTuber named Scrub tried to assassinate my Behemoth DPS build and put out a piss-poor damage comparison against Thundercrash to compare the numbers. There were a lot of things wrong with his damage test. Here are a few of them. He tested base Behemoth damage against Thundercrash and Cuirass. He missed half of his crystals, gutting his damage severely, and he didn't have Synthoceps procced. Now, the last one, you can't really proc Synthoceps in a Rhulk's final stand, so you don't really use Synthoceps. Despite the mistakes, his damage still managed to just barely underperform against Thundercrash, even with him missing several attacks. But he ignored the main benefit of the Behemoth build in the first place, and I'll talk about this more later. So I took some of my friends, and we went into Zulmak in the Pit of Heresy dungeon. We used him as our testing dummy. And I wanted to compile some damage numbers with various Titan supers and abilities to get a proper baseline for the damage numbers right now. Behemoth has a skill gap, Scrub has no skill, so my damage tended to outperform his from his comparison. Here we can see the numbers for Thundercrash by itself and Thundercrash with Cuirass. As you can see, without Cuirass, Thundercrash had 162,000 damage, and with Cuirass, it did 300,000 damage. Essentially, it doubled its damage output. I then tested Behemoth both with and without Synthoceps. The numbers do tend to vary because it's not the most consistent super in the game, but it is consistently strong. The Howl of the Storm melee aspect by itself deals around 28,000 to 30,000 damage, including the crystal detonations. When you have Synthoceps procced, it does about 52,000 damage while you're outside of the super. That's just the melee ability when it's charged. This stacks with 1-2 punch. Using only Howl of the Storm attacks while in the super nets you a total damage of around 300,000 damage, 304 in this case. It outdamaged Thundercrash with Cuirass, including the aftershocks, without needing an exotic. However, putting on Synthoceps, and in one test, I managed to deal a whopping 928,000 damage with just the Behemoth super. No weapons, no other abilities, just the Behemoth using Howl of the Storm. That's over 3 times the damage that I got with Cuirass Thundercrash. Depending on your accuracy and positioning and upkeep with the buff, you can get a very, very variance in damage. One test I got as little as 515,000, still almost double of Cuirass, but it's less than the optimal test. For fun, I also decided to test the previous highest damage Titan super in the game, Burning Maul. Burning Maul requires you to stack up Roaring Flames to ×3, and then also use Synthoceps to get full damage. In a practical test, my friend Cyborg only got around 475k, which even in the best case scenario still underperforms to Synthoceps and Behemoth. Now, all this damage aside, we know clearly now that Behemoth is objectively the strongest Titan super in the game in terms of total damage output. But total damage output isn't the strength to Thundercrash and Cuirass. The burst damage capabilities are mixed with weapon damage output afterwards. Let me quickly explain the difference between burst and sustained DPS. Bosses with shorter damage windows benefit from using burst DPS with quick use supers and then pumping as much special and heavy into them as you can manage. You don't care about total damage numbers because you solely care about doing as much possible damage in the shortest possible window. Caretaker, for example, is a burst DPS boss because he has very short windows to deal damage. Sustained damage is the opposite. You only need to consider sustained DPS in boss fights that either have long damage windows or require multiple phases to kill. Rhulk involved the Disciple in contest mode is a prime example. His damage window is long enough to normally care about ammo conservation, and once you trigger his final stand, his damage window extends for about 10 to 15 seconds. This means it's more important to get all the total possible damage you can, rather than just trying to burst in as much in a short window. This will be the same case when Master Mode releases in the future. Now, onto the Behemoth build. There are actually 2 different aspects to using Behemoth for DPS, both the super and your neutral game. It has phenomenal damage on its own, but with a different set of mods and aspects, you can increase your damage to weapons in your neutral game a lot more. So for the following build, I was using Font of Might, Elemental Charge, High Energy Fire, and Elemental Shards. That one's a Stasis Energy. So after you use any ability, break a crystal, you become charged with light from picking up a shard, and you also get a stacking 20% stasis weapon damage boost on top of everything else that you have. That happens with either your grenade, your Howl melee, or your super, with no cooldown on their spawn rate whatsoever. The current DPS meta revolves around using the Palmyra B stasis rocket launcher with autoloading and explosive light. From a previous Rhulk attempt, I have the damage of a single shot at 73,000 damage, somewhat without counting direct impact damage. With a Divinity, High Energy Fire, and Explosive Light, that damage would be around 136k. When you collect a Stasis Shard from using any abilities, say after doing a super at the very start of a phase, the damage is boosted by Font of Might to deal 163k, not counting direct impacts. That's an additional 30k just from using any Stasis ability. With a basic capacity of 7 rockets, that's like firing at 1.5 extra rockets for free every single time. More damage is simply more damage. If you have the time to use the super and expend your full ammo capacity, Behemoth is better even without using an exotic to boost its damage output. If you happen to be in a situation where you can proc Synthoceps, then it's objectively the strongest super ability in the game. Not even Starter Scales can match its damage output. Not even Mobius Quiver and Orpheus Rigs. Geomags in a Chaos Reach inside a Phoenix Cradle Sunspot matches its total damage output. Scrub, eat your heart out.